Hello, this is Joseph Shore. I wanted to speak to opera lovers everywhere and to fans of my channel who know that I have been both a colleague and a student of Jerome Hines. I wanted to talk a little bit about that great singer, Jerome Hines. And I wanted to talk about him with you in an intimate way, in a way that singers relatively talk about each other. Um, Jerry and I were very close friends to the extent that Jerry was able to be close friends. Jerry had a very funny childhood that affected him greatly. When he was born to a socialite mother and to a Hollywood producer father. And they both thought that they had no time or place for a child in their life. So they took the infant and took him to upstate California to a woman who would raise him as a foster mother, but she wouldn't tell him that she was his foster mother. Jerry grew up in this home believing that this was his mother and that this was his life. And he described it as a very happy first 5 years of his life. But when he was 5 years old, his real mother and father pulled up into the driveway in their car, and they got out and said, "Hello, we're your real mother and father, and you're coming home to live with us." Now, you talk about a shock, and you talk about a shock to the personality development. I don't care whether you use Freud, Jung, or Rogers, or whoever you use. That's a hell of a shock to a kid's psychological development. And he went back home with them to Los Angeles, and he said they fought like cats and dogs. Eventually, the father left, and Jerry was left with his mother living alone. And his mother was very protective and smothering. And he remembers that when he was 15 or 16, he had a little bit of a voice and he could sing and sort of sing. And he liked to imitate Bing Crosby on the radio and sing the songs that Bing Crosby sang. And there happened to be a next door girl. Thank God there was a next door girl. And Jerry wanted to impress her. So he asked his mother if he could possibly take singing lessons. And she, being, overwrought in the extreme and trying to overcompensate for everything, found the best singing teacher she could find in all of Los Angeles. It was Gennaro Curci, the brother-in-law to Madame Gali Curci. And he had been a relatively famous basso cantante in his life. In fact, I think he was called Mr. Hollywood. So Jerry's mother took him to Gennaro Curci to have voice lessons. And within a couple of years, he had become Jerome Hines. Now, Curci had his own opera touring company, and he fit Jerry right into that. And so by the time Jerry was 20 years old, He'd had quite a lot of experience. And Curci got him his first major debut at the age of 18 with the San Francisco Opera, singing the part of Monterone in Rigoletto with Lawrence Tibbett, an aging and somewhat wobbly Lawrence Tibbett, as Rigoletto. And that made an enormous impact on Jerry. And he began singing more with Curci's company and did big roles like Gounod's Faust, Mephisto, and was ready then quite early for an audition with the Metropolitan Opera while he was yet in his 20s. And Curci pulled all the strings that he could to make sure that this young singer got a fair audition with the Metropolitan Opera. Later on, Jerry would admit that if he hadn't had Curci working for him, his career would never have happened. But thank God, for history's sake, he did have Curci, and he did get that audition with the Met, and it was a fair audition, and Edward Johnson was still there as general director, a tenor from Canada, and he loved talent, unlike later administrators, and he hired Jerry immediately. So just as a young, early 20s basso, he had reached the top of his career. And they started him very easily with very small roles, but then very quickly moved him up the ladder. And by 1949, Jerome Hines was Jerome Hines. And the rest was history. Well, I got to know Jerry later in his life. In 1976, I auditioned for him. 1975, excuse me. I auditioned for him, and he went gaga over me and thought I was the next best thing to sliced bread, and hired me for his own opera company. He had his own opera company, which sang his opera called I Am the Way, which was a sacred opera on the life of Christ that he had written. And he sang the part of Jesus in it, and it was a tough part. But I auditioned for the baritone part of St. Peter and got that as I auditioned for him in 1975. And we became fast friends, and I was with him for the rest of his life. And towards the end of his life, after Lucia had died and he was all alone, he was left with himself and with his life to make a judgment on how well he had lived and what impact he had made. That's what any artist wants to know. Did I make any impact? Will anybody remember me? I taught as a professor at the University of North Carolina, and I was doing a class for graduate students, doctoral students, students working for their Doctor of Musical Arts. And I was giving them a lesson in musical history. And do you know that out of the 3 students that they were studying for their DMA, None of them knew who Caruso was. None of them knew who Chaliapin was. And before the top of my head blew off in steam, I realized how fleeting is fame. Is there any wonder that artists have this need to be remembered? Because it is so fleeting. Did anybody remember what I did? And as Jerry was aging, as he survived the loss of his wife, as he was approaching 80 years old, he would call me up every night and talk to me and say, "Joe, was I any good? Did I really sing well?" And I would say to him every night, "Jerry, the critics all say that the greatest basses of the 20th century were Pinza, Siepi, Tozzi, and Hines." And I hoped that that would satisfy him. But he would say, "But was I the greatest bass of all time?" And I would have to say, "Jerry, you were one of the greatest. Can't that do? Is that not okay?" And that would be okay for a day. And he would call me again the next night and say, "Joe, was I any good really?" And we would go through the same thing every night. Every artist wants to know one thing. Did I get it across? Do you understand what I was doing? Did it make any impact in your life? Was it worthwhile? And every night I would try to calm him and say, "Jerry, you were one of the greatest basses of all time. I loved you, and I loved singing with you." And that would calm him for a while. For a while. And then the next night would come. So what I want you to get from this is that artists live with this need to be understood, or at least this need to know that somebody got it, that somebody understood the value of what we were doing, that it wasn't all in vain, that it didn't all last for an instant without any observer understanding and evaluating it. Every artist, every one of us goes through that. Now I'm 70 years old. If I live longer, maybe when I'm 80, I'll call up one of my students and I'll say, "Was I really any good? Did anybody really get it?" And I don't know what they'll say back to me, because it's getting harder. to find people who really got it. Good night for now.